You can call me Kane. That's not my real name, but it's the one that stuck after the transition. There's something final about it. Short, sharp, and unyielding. It feels like it was forged for this purpose, the purpose I didn't ask for, but the one I now shoulder. Once, I was just another face in the crowd. Now, I'm the gatekeeper, the enforcer, the one who decides. It started during a blackout. I don't mean a memory lapse, I mean the kind of blackout that wraps you in suffocating silence and complete darkness. One moment, I was racing down the highway, rain hammering against my windshield, my mind cluttered with worries about overdue bills, a messy divorce, and a job I'd long since lost the will to care about. The next moment? The crash. The details of that night were swallowed by the void, but I woke up somewhere impossible. The air hummed with electricity. Shadows stretched unnaturally across a cracked, endless road, and in the distance, I saw a figure, a tall, looming silhouette against the backdrop of faint, glowing mist. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hollow gaze stripped me bare, peeling back my life in seconds. I wanted to protest, to tell him he had the wrong man. But deep down, I knew he didn't. He tossed me a key, small, unassuming, but strangely heavy, and motioned toward a decrepit gate that had appeared behind me. That was my welcome to the in-between, the liminal space where the living bleed into the unknown. I became the arbiter of passage, not by choice but by necessity. My predecessor had been there too long, he said, and he needed rest. Rest. I laughed when he said it, but now I understand. This job doesn't just take your time. It takes your humanity, piece by piece. The job is deceptively simple: judge those who arrive. The decisions are heavier than the sky itself, but I learned quickly. It's not about punishment or reward, it's about balance. Some are ready to move on, to face what's beyond. Others need to go back, to try again or to clean up their messes. And a few are better off erased, reduced to nothing more than dust on the wind. My new office is a bridge. Not the kind you'd imagine. It's suspended over a chasm of shifting fog, where tendrils of light and shadow battle endlessly. On one side, faint outlines of forgotten lives linger, waiting for their moment of clarity. On the other, there's only the unknown, a swirling vortex of infinite possibilities. The bridge spans the gap, and I sit in the middle, a lonely gatekeeper at the point of no return. The first soul arrived at sunrise, or what felt like sunrise in this place. A young woman named Elise, her jeans torn, her jacket muddy, and her face streaked with blood. She stumbled toward me, dazed, holding her side where a jagged wound seeped crimson. Her voice was weak when she asked, "Where am I?" "You're on the edge," I told her. "And you need to decide where you're going." I don't understand," she stammered. "I was hiking, and there was this fall." I nodded. "Yeah. I know." Her story unraveled quickly. She'd been hiking alone to escape a messy breakup, to find clarity in nature, but the rain had made the trail slippery, and a misstep sent her tumbling down an embankment. Her injuries had been worse than she realized, and the cold night had done the rest. I felt her shame and regret more than her words conveyed. "I wasn't ready," she said softly, her voice trembling with tears. "I didn't even get to apologize." "To him?" I guessed. She nodded. "You think it would have changed anything?" "Yes," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. He didn't deserve what I said. I just wanted him to hurt the way I was hurting." I leaned back, scanning her face. Some souls lied to themselves in these moments, clinging to half-truths. But Elise? Her regret was raw, real. That mattered. "You've got a choice," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You can cross this bridge. Whatever's on the other side, you'll face it as you are. Or, you can go back. Fix what you left broken. Her wide eyes searched mine, desperate for certainty I couldn't offer. But, what if I don't make it back in time? That's the risk, Elise. It's always a risk. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she'd cross. But then she squared her shoulders, her gaze hardening with resolve. I have to try. I pointed her back toward the faint light on the horizon. The bridge behind her shimmered and disappeared, leaving her with one path: return to the living. Don't waste it, I called after her. She didn't look back. The next arrival was a man who carried himself like he owned the world. Slicked back hair, expensive shoes, and an expression that screamed entitlement. He was already muttering to himself as he walked toward me, frustration bleeding into every movement. "Excuse me," he snapped, glaring at the gap beyond the bridge. "There's been a mistake. I don't belong here." "You all think that," I replied dryly. "What's your name?" He frowned but eventually muttered, "David." I glanced at the shadows forming behind him, the fragmented echoes of his life. David Morris. Wall Street shark. Piles of money, piles of power, piles of broken lives left in your wake. Ring a bell? His jaw tightened. "You don't know me." "I know enough." I gestured toward the bridge. "Tell me, David, do you think the people you stepped on deserved it? The colleagues you threw under the bus, the families you ruined with your greed?" He hesitated, his polished confidence cracking. "I was just doing my job. And now I'm doing mine," I said, standing. "So answer the question. Do you think you made the world better or worse?" His silence was deafening, a thick, oppressive weight that hung in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Worse." I pointed left, to the dark abyss. Then you know what happens next, staring at the abyss I had pointed him toward. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the remnants of his ego clearly warring with the sudden realization of what this meant. They always hesitate. They want to argue, to bargain, but deep down, they know. He knew. "Wait," he said, his voice unsteady. You don't understand. I didn't have a choice. If I hadn't done what I did, I'd have lost everything. My career, your career, your reputation." I cut in. "Is that really all you were afraid of losing?" David flinched, his gaze dropping to the cracked pavement beneath his expensive shoes. I could feel the memories rising in him, unbidden. 1,000 small betrayals, each justified in the name of ambition. The assistant he fired for refusing to falsify numbers. The small-town pension fund he knowingly drained to pad his bottom line. The family he abandoned because they were holding him back. "You did have a choice," I said, stepping closer. "And you made it. Over and over again. So don't stand here and tell me otherwise." He looked up at me then, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something like remorse in his eyes. But it wasn't remorse, not really. It was fear. Fear of what lay ahead. "Can't I?" he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can't I go back? Like the woman before me?" "No," I said, flatly. Elise still had unfinished business, something worth returning for. "You, David? You burned all your bridges long before you got here." He opened his mouth to argue, but the abyss answered for him. It seemed to shift, to pull at him, and the air around us grew colder. He staggered backward, clutching at his chest as though he could stop the inevitable. His voice faltered as the shadows began to wrap around his legs, pulling him toward the edge. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't mean for it to end like this. But it didn't matter. Intentions only carried so much weight here, and his actions had long since tipped the scales." With a final, strangled cry, David disappeared into the void. The silence that followed was almost deafening, but it didn't last. It never did. The next arrival caught me off guard. She always does. I heard her before I saw her, the unmistakable sound of laughter, bright and ringing. It was the kind of sound you didn't hear often in a place like this. When she finally stepped into view, she was everything her laughter promised, young, full of life, and utterly unbothered by the surreal surroundings. "Well, this is interesting," she said, spinning in a slow circle as she took in the endless expanse of the bridge and the abyss beyond. "Not what I was expecting, but I guess it's better than fire and brimstone." "Depends on your perspective," I replied, leaning back against my post. "Name?" She turned to me with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Lila. Lila Monroe." The shadows flickered behind her, and her life began to take shape. Lila was the kind of person who made an impression wherever she went. She was loud, unapologetic, and fiercely independent. But she was also reckless, and that recklessness had cost her more than she cared to admit. "You didn't make it to the hospital," I said, watching her reaction. For the first time, her grin faltered. "No. I guess I didn't." She had been driving too fast, trying to make it back in time to see her father before he went into surgery. The crash had been violent, and I could still feel the echoes of her panic as she fought to stay conscious, to keep the promise she'd made to herself. She didn't want her father to die without knowing she cared. "You're not ready to cross," I said, surprising even myself. She tilted her head, studying me. "Why not? Isn't that what people come here for?" "Sometimes. But not you. You've still got too much left to say." The words hit her harder than I expected, and she sank to the ground, her knees drawn to her chest. For all her bravado, Lila wasn't as fearless as she seemed. "I never told him," she said quietly. "Not once. I thought I had all the time in the world to say it, and now." "You've got one shot," I said, pointing her back toward the path Elise had taken. "Use it." She hesitated, her fingers clutching the hem of her shirt. "What if I don't make it in time? What if I screw it up again?" "Then at least you'll know you tried," I said. "And that's more than most people can say." Her grin returned, softer this time but no less genuine. "You're not as scary as you look, you know." "Don't push your luck," I replied, though I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corners of my mouth. She stood, brushing the dust off her jeans, and with one last glance over her shoulder, she walked away. The bridge shimmered behind her, leaving me alone once more. The next visitor was the kind of soul that made me question the fairness of all this. He was young, no older than 17, and his eyes were wide with fear as he stumbled toward me. His name was Ben, and the shadows behind him told a story I wish I hadn't seen. A life cut short by someone else's cruelty. A boy who had done nothing to deserve the end he got. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice shaking. "You're at the bridge," I said, my tone gentler than usual. "And you're here because it wasn't your time." He blinked at me, confused. "Then, why am I here? Shouldn't I be alive?" I finished for him. "Yes. And that's exactly where you're going." He looked at me like I was some kind of miracle worker, his expression caught somewhere between hope and disbelief. I can go back." "You can," I said, stepping aside to clear his path. "But you've got to fight for it. Don't give up, no matter how hard it gets." Tears filled his eyes as he nodded, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt something close to peace. Watching him walk away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Not every soul gets to cross. Some need a second chance, and others, like David, don't. But every decision I make feels like a weight, a balance I'm constantly trying to maintain. As the horizon began to shift, I knew the next soul wouldn't make my job any easier. I had just sent Ben back when the fog shifted again, and I braced myself. The air around me turned heavier, colder. I've been at this long enough to know when something darker was on its way. Sure enough, a hulking figure emerged from the mist, dragging the kind of energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He stopped just short of the bridge, looking me over with a sneer. His clothes were torn and bloodied, his knuckles bruised and swollen. The kind of man who looked like he spent his life looking for fights, and winning them. His name came to me before he even opened his mouth. Damien Cross. I didn't need the shadows to know he wasn't a good man. "What's this?" he barked, his voice rough and gravelly. "Some kind of joke?" "No joke," I said, leaning against the post and crossing my arms. "You're here because it's your time." "Bullshit," he spat, taking a step closer. "You think you can scare me with this purgatory crap? You don't know who you're dealing with." "Don't I?" I replied, tilting my head as I studied him. Damien Cross. Career criminal. Assault, armed robbery, and a murder rap you dodged on a technicality. Shall I go on? For the first time, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by anger. "You think you're better than me? Sitting here, passing judgment on people you don't even know?" "I don't have to know you," I said, stepping closer. "Your actions speak louder than anything you could ever say." He snorted, folding his arms across his broad chest. "Yeah? Then tell me this, wise guy. Where do I go? Heaven? Hell? Or are you just gonna let me rot here?" "That depends," I said. "Tell me, Damien, do you regret it?" "Regret what?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "The lives you destroyed," I said, my voice hardening. "The people you left broken. Do you regret any of it?" His smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Regrets for the weak," he said, his tone defiant. "You do what you gotta do to survive in this world. That's all there is to it." I sighed, shaking my head. "Then you've already made your choice." Before he could respond, the shadows came for him. They wrapped around his legs, pulling him toward the abyss. He fought, of course, men like Damien always do, but it was futile. The void doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't care how strong you think you are. As the last remnants of Damien disappeared into the darkness, I felt a familiar pang of emptiness. Judging souls like his never gets easier, no matter how much they deserve it. But there wasn't time to dwell. The fog was shifting again, signaling the arrival of another soul. The next car to appear was an old pickup, its once red paint faded to rust. The driver was a middle-aged woman, her hands trembling as she gripped the wheel. Her name was Claire, and her story unfolded before me like a sad, familiar song. She had been a nurse, the kind who worked double shifts without complaint, who stayed long after her shift ended to comfort patients who had no one else. She was kind, selfless even, but her kindness had its limits. The shadows behind her showed a life of quiet suffering. An abusive husband who drained her emotionally, a job that drained her physically, and a lifetime of putting everyone else's needs before her own. In the end, it was a heart attack that brought her here, an inevitable result of the years she spent neglecting herself. "Claire," I said softly as she stepped out of the truck. "Do you know where you are?" She shook her head, her eyes darting nervously between me and the bridge. "Am I dead?" "Not quite," I replied. "You're at a crossroads. And you have a choice to make." Her brow furrowed as she looked around, taking in the endless expanse of fog and the chasm beyond the bridge. "A choice?" I nodded. "You've spent your entire life giving to others, Claire. But now, it's time to decide, are you ready to move on, or do you want to go back and finally take care of yourself?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "Go back? How?" "My heart. It won't be easy," I said, my tone gentle but firm. "But if you go back, you'll have a chance to live for yourself this time. No more putting everyone else first. Just you. She hesitated, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. But what if I can't? What if I fall back into the same patterns? Then at least you'll know you tried, I said. And that's more than most people can say. For a long moment, she stood there, torn between fear and hope. But eventually, she nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. I'll go back, she said, her voice steady. I pointed her toward the path that led back to the living. Take it one step at a time, Claire. You'll figure it out. As she walked away, the fog shifted again, signaling the arrival of yet another soul. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever, or whoever, was next. This time, it wasn't a car that appeared but a figure walking alone, shrouded in shadows. The air grew colder as he approached, and I felt a familiar sense of dread creeping over me. The man who stepped out of the mist was young, no older than 30, with piercing eyes and a cruel smirk. His name was Marcus, and the darkness behind him was almost palpable. He was a predator, the kind of man who thrived on manipulation and control. The kind who left a trail of broken lives in his wake. Marcus, I said, my voice colder than usual. Do you know why you're here? He smirked, his hands shoved casually into his pockets. Not really, but I'm guessing it's not for a chat. I stepped closer, my gaze never leaving his. You hurt people, Marcus. Not out of necessity, but because you enjoyed it. Tell me, do you feel any remorse for what you've done? His smirk widened, and he leaned toward me, his voice dripping with mockery. Remorse? For what? If they were stupid enough to let me use them, that's on them, not me. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. And then I stepped aside, gesturing toward the abyss. Then you know where you're going. His confidence faltered as he looked at the swirling darkness, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Wait, what are you? But it was too late. The shadows rose up, pulling him toward the void. He fought, of course, men like Marcus always do, but in the end, the void always wins. As the last traces of Marcus disappeared, I turned back to the fog, already bracing myself for the next arrival. This job never gets easier, but someone after Marcus disappeared into the void, but I felt an unease creeping up my spine. Something was off. I couldn't place it right away, but it was like the weight of the bridge itself had shifted ever so slightly. It was the kind of feeling that made me glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, watching. But there was nothing. Just the endless fog and the faint hum of the chasm below. Before I could dwell on it, another car rolled up. This one was sleek and black, the kind of car that screamed wealth and power. I straightened, my fingers tightening around the edges of my post as the driver's door swung open. Out stepped a woman, tall and commanding, with sharp features and an air of confidence that could have cut through steel. Her name came to me immediately, Evelyn Kane. A corporate powerhouse. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly unflinching. She was the kind of person who left an impression wherever she went, and not always a good one. Evelyn, I said, leaning slightly forward. Welcome to the bridge. She raised an eyebrow, her expression calm and unreadable. And what exactly is this? Some kind of existential tollbooth? I smirked despite myself. You could call it that. Or you could call it the last stop before whatever comes next. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, she crossed her arms and tilted her head, studying me. And you're the one who decides what comes next. That's the gist of it, I replied. But the truth is, you decide. I just facilitate. She chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. How democratic. I stepped out from behind my post, the shadows of her life already flickering to life behind her. Evelyn Kane was a woman of ambition, a self-made force of nature. She had clawed her way to the top of an unforgiving industry, shattering glass ceilings and crushing anyone who stood in her way. But her victories came at a cost. Friends. Family. Her own humanity. All sacrificed on the altar of success. "You've spent your life chasing power," I said, my voice steady. "And now that you have it, tell me, was it worth it?" For the first time, her composure cracked, just slightly. Her jaw tightened, and she looked past me, toward the chasm beyond the bridge. "I did what I had to do," she said finally. "No one gave me anything. I built my empire from nothing." "I'm not asking about what you built," I said, taking a step closer. "I'm asking if it made you happy." Her lips parted as though she was about to argue, but no sound came. Instead, she looked down at her hands, the weight of her choices settling over her like a shroud. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It didn't." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. "Then you've got a choice. You can cross the bridge and leave it all behind, or you can go back. Start over. Try to live a life that actually means something." Her eyes snapped back to mine, sharp and calculating. "And what guarantee do I have that it'll be different? That I'll be different?" "There are no guarantees," I said. "Only the chance to try." She hesitated, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. And then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Fine. I'll go back." I gestured toward the path that led to the living. "Then don't waste it." She gave me one last glance, her expression unreadable, before walking away. The fog swallowed her whole, leaving me alone once more. The next visitor was different. I knew it the moment I saw him. He didn't arrive in a car, didn't step out of the fog like the others. He simply appeared, standing at the edge of the bridge as though he'd always been there. He was tall and wiry, with a face that was both familiar and alien at the same time. His eyes glowed faintly, the kind of glow that made my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease creeping through me. He smiled, a cold, unsettling smile. "You already know the answer to that." And I did. I didn't know how, but I did. He wasn't a soul to judge, wasn't here to cross or return. He was something else entirely. Something I'd hoped never to encounter. "You shouldn't be here," I said, stepping forward to block his path. "This place isn't for you." He chuckled, the sound low and hollow. "Oh, Kane. Always so quick to play by the rules. But don't you ever wonder who made those rules? And why?" I didn't answer. My fingers twitched at my sides, ready to grab the blade that hung invisibly at my hip. I hadn't used it in years, but I could feel its weight now, humming with latent power. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice cold. He tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. "The same thing you do. To understand. To decide. But unlike you, I'm not content to stay in my little box." I drew the blade without hesitation, its edge cutting through the air with a sound like thunder. The man didn't flinch, but his smile widened, his teeth impossibly sharp. "You can't stop me," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You know that, don't you?" "Maybe not," I replied, tightening my grip on the blade. "But I can try." The air around us shifted, growing heavier with each passing second. The fog darkened, and the chasm below began to stir, its tendrils of light and shadow writhing like living things. I could feel the bridge groaning beneath our feet, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was afraid. Not for myself, but for the bridge, for the balance it represented. If this man, this thing, was here to disrupt it, then everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed, could be undone in an instant. But I couldn't let that happen. Not without a fight.